Hi, and welcome back to Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics. I'm your host, John Strazicich, and this is where meaning is always context-driven. And we're continuing on here in our series in the book of Romans. And we will finish up chapter 10 here today in verses 14 to 21. Okay, then coming here then to Robert Jewett, we will use some of the comments that he made to set the table for us in coming to this unit. There is a wide consensus that 10:14 to 21 constitutes a separate pericope with a shift in rhetorical style to that of diatribe, and an inferential therefore, that carries the argument forward from the end of the preceding pericope. The diatribe opens with an elegant rhetorical climax, sometimes referred to as a gradatio, in which each succeeding line of 10:14 to 15 takes up a motif from the preceding line. The opening rhetorical question takes up the word epikaleo, call upon, in the climactic phase of the preceding pericope, and that's found in 10:12 to 13. But in contrast to the preceding pericope, the voice here is that of Paul rather than that of personified righteousness by faith. The structure of the climax is listed below. Pos un epikalesontai, eis han uk epistiuson, pos de pistiusosin, hu uk ekuson, pos de akusosin, choris kerusontos, pos de keruxosin, eon me apostolosin. This series of four rhetorical questions opens a powerful syllogism, starting with the presence of saving faith and moving chronologically backwards through hearing, preaching, and sending of preachers. This climactic series of rhetorical questions provides the framework for the following verses, which contain three additional rhetorical questions, producing the satisfying series of 7. The last motif is taken up first in the subsequent series of 6 citations. Okay, then we will add Frank Theilman here for some additional sauce. Paul's formulation of the rhetorical question, then indicates a turn in the argument. And he says to see 9:14, 9:30, 11:1, and 11:11. The turn is not so drastic, however, that the main subject has changed. He continues to address the problem announced in 9:30 to 32, that although many within Israel have heard the gospel, 10:19a, few have believed it, and instead Gentiles who were not even seeking God have surprisingly found him, 10:20. The subject of Paul's third-person plural verbs in the first three questions, then, is Israel, just as it was in 9:32 and 10:2 to 3, where he last used the third-person plural. Paul's series of questions traces the natural sequence of the transmission of an important message from its sender to its recipients, and does so backwards to form a link between his new train of thought and the immediately preceding sentence. In 10:13, he had spoken of the simplicity of receiving salvation. It was available to anyone, whether Jew or Greek, who called upon the name of the Lord. Now he raises the question of whether those Jews who have rejected the gospel have actually received a fair chance of hearing, understanding, and embracing it. With his question, Paul admits that for the Jews to call upon the Lord must send heralds out with news of who he is, and they must communicate their message to the Jews, who must in turn believe it. Okay, just a few things here. We are not going to agree here with just everything that Dr. Theilman has said. but we would agree here that that Paul definitely, he continues here to address the problem announced in 9:30 to 32, and he hasn't turned from that main subject. It has not changed, and so we're definitely going to agree with that. And that we do understand that Israel here is primarily the main group that Paul's addressing here. So we're just in general agreement here. But there is some room here, up until at least verse 18, room for the Gentile audience to be included here. Within this, within Paul's speech here, but we see beginning with 19, where from 19 to 21, where it really he takes a hard turn to get us make sure that we're back on topic, with Israel's failure to obey the gospel. And so but it was important here that we hear Theilman out here, so that's why I've included it. Okay, now we'll get down to the business here of translation. Here we come to Romans 10:14, beginning here with the interrogative posts. Therefore, how shall they call upon whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe on whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear apart from one who preaches? And how shall they preach except they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good things. But not all have obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? Therefore, faith is from hearing, and hearing through a word of Christ. But I say, is it not that they have not heard? To the contrary, their voice goes out into all the earth, their words are at the end of the world. But I say, Israel did not know, did they? Moses first says, I shall make them jealous by a no nation, and by a foolish nation I shall provoke them to anger. Now Isaiah dares and says, or he's bold and says, I was found by those who did not seek me, and I became manifest to those who did not call upon me. But to Israel, he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. Okay, I think that's a good translation. Okay, then when we come here then to this particular unit here, this is point 3 here, because we saw that chapter 9 ended with verses 30 to 33. That was the first point here of this second unit here within Romans 9 to 11, and then the second part we saw the last time in from 10:1 to 13, and then this is the third unit here that finishes up chapter 10 verses 14 to 21. And I entitled this Paul's concluding scriptural midrash concerning Israel's rejection and the Gentiles' acceptance of the gospel message, and that covers 10:14 to 21. And I broke it down into two big main points. First is Paul's series of rhetorical questions concerning the methodological process of salvation, and that's going to then covers verses 14 to 17. And it began, and so within this first unit here, I have four there are four main points that he makes, and it begins off here with Paul's four temporal sequences put in interrogative, in a rhetorical question type manner. How shall they call upon whom they have not believed? It begins like this, and it's Paul's four temporal sequences and God's method of salvation. And we can view it like that. Calling requires faith. Faith requires hearing. Hearing requires one who preaches. And a preacher requires that he be commissioned. And so these questions all here revolve around that. And then Paul makes this midrashic scriptural verification of God's method of salvation, and he picks up here Isaiah 52. How beautiful on the mountains are those who preach good things. And then Paul has a contrasting caveat to the method of salvation, which is human free will, but not all have believed. Okay, so that's Paul's contrasting caveat to this method of salvation. And he makes this assertion: not all have obeyed the gospel. And then he gives a scriptural basis when he cites, Isaiah 53. O Lord, who has believed our report. And that cipher then is really wide open, because everyone then is going to understand Isaiah 53. You have to fill in, and it makes perfect sense. But just by quoting, the beginning of Isaiah 53:1, then everyone knows that the whole chapter then has to be taken up, and that's just intuitive. And then Paul has a summarizing statement of faith's methodological process of salvation, where he says, therefore, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through a word of Christ. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then here on the second part here, in verses 18 to 21, Paul has then, he basically has two questions, a Q&A. He has his first Q&A here in verse 18, and then he takes up a second Q&A, and that covers all of 19 to 21. It is somewhat off balance there, but he does have two question and answers. And for this unit here of 18 to 21, I have Paul's two adversative rhetorical questions and scriptural answers concerning hearing and knowing the gospel message. And then in bold relief, Israel's rejection and the Gentiles' acceptance. And then he has here his first Q&A. Have they not all heard? And so at this point here, it's still open to question. In verse 18 about who Paul is mainly addressing here. But obviously here from 18, it's universal in scope, so that we can easily say that he's addressing both Jews and Gentiles. But when you come down here to 19 to 21, this is where then this colors everything, even going backwards here, so that you could even get Theilman saying that this whole thing's really about Israel. And I think Paul left Israel out up until here in verse 19, where he introduces them. But it's rather heavy here, especially how it ends. And that leads us into the third part, chapter 11. But in these two question and answer series here, he's his first Q&A, it's have they not all heard? And so he quotes then from Psalm 19, and so that now instead of the creation speaking, vis-a-vis the Rikia and the Shemayim that's from Psalm 19, verse 1. That the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament declares the works of his hands. So he takes that message and now it becomes a cipher then for the gospel's voice. And so then, so here it says that the gospel has a universal reach, and its message also has a universal reach. It's not just that it's heard, but that it's the message of the gospel has gone out universally. And then Paul's second Q&A here comes up here, and it's a two-part answer here. He first then the question here is, has not Israel known? And then he comes back, and his first answer, he takes up Moses, in the form of a lex talionis, that God makes Israel jealous by the Gentiles' acceptance of the gospel, and God then angers Israel by a foolish nation's acceptance of the gospel. And then he uses Isaiah then here for the second part of this answer again, and he then quotes Isaiah 65. He quoted the Ha'azinu of Deuteronomy 32, verse 19, and then he's going to finish it off with Isaiah 65, where we have a midrashic use of Isaiah's irony, God's self-disclosure to a passive audience, i.e. the Gentiles, and God's loving appeal to Israel's defiant obstinacy in bold opposite relief. And the chapter ends on a very, very negative note, where the whole thing began back there, when Paul summed up what he was saying in 9:6 to 29 in 30 to 33, and that tells why Israel, they is because they didn't believe, and that is exactly how he ends up here. By quoting the scripture in midrashic form. Okay, then coming here then to this particular slide, we will pick up some diagrammatical issues here. And on this slide, I can only fit verses 14 to 15, but this is a big, long, compound sentence that ends in verse 16, and it will come down there to this all, and then it'll say something like uk, and then something like pontes, hupe kusan to euangelio. But not all have believed the gospel. So all of this big long compound sentence there then comes down to a contrast of statement in verse 16. So we have this syllogistic chain sentence here that in 14 to 15, and then it is then interrupted by 16, contrasted, I should say, with verse 16, but not all have obeyed the gospel. And that's where the sentence is going to properly end. So you need to look at verses 14 through 16 as it's drawing a contrast here. But so we begin here. We begin here in verse 14 here, and we have this inferential conjunction un here, serving as a header for a new paragraph. And it does function to sum up the previous unit, because it's certainly verses 12 and 13 have generated for Paul the repeated use of the verb epikaleo here in verse 14 here. And you can see even here from verse 13, everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And then he says, how therefore shall they call on whom they have not believed? And then, these rhetorical questions continue in this chain. But you need to see that the Stichwort that hinges and connects the previous unit to the new unit is going to be done by the verb epikaleo here. And here in all these verbs here, whether it be epikalesontai here in verse 14, or epistusosin, kusosin, or keruksosin, these are all going to then, these are all, these are all subjunctive moods, and they're aorist here, and they're deliberative subjunctives here, and that is that's by and large the consensus of scholars here. So these are all going to be aorist, and this is an aorist middle form here. But anyhow, so this is just used, within rhetorical questions. A hypothetical thought such as this is grammaticalized in by the subjunctive mood, and that's the function here of the subjunctive here. But anyhow, and so when we come here then to our base here is, our base verb here is epikalesontai here. How shall they call on whom they have not believed? And when we come here to Han here, then this is going to then there is no antecedent. The antecedent is headless here, and typically most scholars are going to want to say that the that the demonstrative pronoun something like teuton here, it's going to be all encapsulated here within this Han here, for this relative clause, and it continues, and see, we can see how it's all connected here by de and de here. This is just the compounding of the sentences into one big long sentence, and then it's contrasted, as we said down here in verse 16, and it goes on here, and how shall they believe in whom they have not heard, and how shall they hear apart from one who preaches, and how shall they preach? And then we go into a conditional sentence, except they are sent, and then there's this comparative clause, just as, and then it quotes this scripture here without the citation formula, just as, it's gegroptai here, just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good things. And we'll have a lot to say here about this quotation here, and how Paul modifies it. He appropriates it, and then he resignifies it for the apostolic community of his generation. and we'll look at this as we move along. But what's important to see, and then we have posts here. This is just the adverbial particle, an interrogative here, and it occurs here, these 4 times here, and it creates the hypothetical questions here. So what we have here is that calling requires faith, and faith requires hearing, and hearing requires one who preaches, and those who preach must be commissioned. They have to be sent here, and so Paul would see himself as being commissioned by the risen Christ himself, along with the apostolic community, and that the message comes directly from Christ to the messenger, and then from the messenger to the masses. And this is God's method of salvation. So if you want to really look at the modus operandi of how salvation occurs, well, this is part of the biblical record of the method of salvation. It all begins with God, who then commissions his apostles. And then the apostles then preach the message, and then from those who hear, they partake of faith, and those who partake of faith then call upon the name of the Lord. And then, as we saw here in the capstone in verses 12 and 13, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so that is the method of salvation, and that's why is here, because it's summing up the method of salvation, and then Paul is bringing it backwards here, starting from the end point, going back to its inception, starting with God. All things start with God, of course. And so this is it's very important then, that we understand that the people, the gospel came directly from God, and the message, stems from God, and then it's incumbent upon we who hear the gospel that we respond to it. Through the message comes the Christ speaking through the messengers. Christ's word himself, Christ's very own word, is heard through the preaching of the gospel. So prevenient grace comes through the preaching of the gospel, where the word of Christ is actually heard, by the individual. He's not just hearing the apostolic emissaries. He's hearing the origin source coming from Christ himself, and that's how all of us got saved. We all got saved, under the conviction and power of the Holy Spirit, that activated the word that was preached within us, and we responded. Hopefully, we responded in a positive manner to be saved. Some have yet to do that, but this is the method here that God uses, and we can then sum up here the words here of C.E.B. Cranfield. Its substance can be summed up in 4 statements. They can only call upon Christ in the sense of verses 12 and 13 if they have already believed on him. They can only believe on him if they have heard him. speaking to them through the message about him. They can only hear him if someone proclaims the message. The message can only be proclaimed if God commissions someone to proclaim it. So here, Charles Cranfield has just made plain here the words of Paul here in verses 14 and 15. Okay, then we come here. We're just going to pick up a few last thoughts here on this slide. And we can see here as we've moved down here, the first question, how shall they call, and how shall they believe? And notice here, how shall they believe on whom they have not heard? And notice here that this takes the genitive. So that's, anytime you have the word akuo, typically, it takes the genitive. So they're talking about that they have heard from the actual person. And then we have this improper preposition chorus here. How shall they believe apart from one who preaches? We have the substantival use here of the participle. And then we have here in the last rhetorical question, how shall they preach? And then we have this on may, we have this conditionalized sentence. So this here is the apodosis, and this down here is the protasis, except they be sent. And then we have this typical this, I guess we would say it's an introductory scriptural reference clause, kathos gegroptai, just as it is written. This is typically used to introduce a scriptural quotation. And then Paul then quotes here from Isaiah 52. And the quotation is Paul, he's basically appropriating and resignifying the especially the original context, and we will look at this in some little bit of detail here and in the changes that he makes, but he quotes here and says, just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those, and this is in the plural, who preach good things. And then we're going to then have to then come back here and look at the MT. We'll have to look at the LXX, and then we're going to have to review what Paul does, and how he differs from both the MT and the LXX. And definitely Paul is really not. He's following more of the MT than he is the LXX. We'll see this. But Paul deviates from the MT in order to, as I call it, there's the, it's called, it's appropriation and resignification of Scripture. And that's what Paul's doing here. In this particular instance, he's appropriating and resignifying the diachronic, quotation in order to bring it into use for the present time of Paul's calling. Okay, then when we come here then to this slide, we're looking up here. This is the Septuagint here, Septuagint text of Isaiah 52:7, and what we have here in the middle is the MT, the Masoretic text, and in its contextual setting. And then down here at the bottom we have Paul's appropriation of Isaiah 52:7. And we're going to see that there's going to be, Paul's reading of it, his when he actually appropriates from it, when he, by means of displacement and distillation and recontextualization, he's going to make it conform to the apostolic mission. And we're going to see that there's, significant parts here, how Paul literally edited the text of Isaiah to bring it into conformity with the apostolic mission. And this actually does happen quite often. We saw that our last time, when Paul's transformation of Deuteronomy, his use of it in chapter 31 in the previous unit. And so Paul continues, this, it's important for us to look at Paul's use of Scripture and how does he use it. And we're going to broach here the topic of what we would call intertextuality. So we're going to look up here, first of all, with the Septuagint. And it begins here, diatuta, all right? And it says, "For this reason, my people shall know my name in that day, because I am he, I am the one who speaks, I am present." And then he says he's present, and it continues on here in verse 7. He's present how? And he gives two comparative clauses here, starting with hosts. As, we'll just say, as a timely event upon the mountains, and as the feet of one who preaches a report of peace, as one who proclaims good things, because I shall make your salvation heard, saying, O Zion, your God reigns. So if you look at that translation, and that's the Septuagint's version, and we don't know if they have a separate Hebrew forlage, because it reads quite different than the MT here. And if we look here, beginning here in verse 6 of the Masoretic text, the MT, Lachain yeda ami shemi, Lachain bayom hahu ki ani hu, hamidaber hineni, ma navu al heharim ragle mibaser, mashmia shalom, mibaser tov, mashmia Yeshua, omer letzion malak Elohayik, which just says, therefore my people shall know my name, therefore in that day, for I am he, the one who is speaking, behold, it is I. Ma navu, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the mibaser. This is the feet of the one who announces good news, publishing shalom, peace, or causing peace to be heard. So we say publishing peace. The one who proclaims, we'll just say, good news, the mibaser of tov, of good things, who causes salvation to be heard, or publishes salvation, saying to Zion, your God reigns. Now, just for the context, we got to look. The voice of your watchmen, they have lifted up the voice, together they shall shout, for I shall see when Yahweh restores Zion. Break forth, shout together, O waste places of Jerusalem, for Yahweh will have compassion upon his people, he shall redeem Jerusalem. And Yahweh has laid bare his holy arm to the eyes of all nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. So we can see that this context is highly it's centered in Zion, right here, to Zion and Jerusalem and God's people. Okay, and God's restoring the waste places of Jerusalem. So this is where the feet of the Mibaser, they're upon the mountains that surround Jerusalem, and they're bringing announcement of salvation and peace, that God's restoring Zion. Now, when Paul published, he says, just as it is said, this is what he says, and how shall they preach except they are sent, just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good things, and that's how he ends it. Okay, so notice here that the location, Paul takes away Zion, he takes away upon the mountains. Okay, how beautiful are the feet of those. It's not how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of those. And he's not talking that this message is tailor-made for Zion here, as in Isaiah. Okay, both the Septuagint and the MT are talking about Zion, talking about Jerusalem, talking about when God restores, Zion. So now what Paul's doing is he's taking this message here of Isaiah, he's making he's appropriating and resignifying this for the evangelization of the world, to bring it into conformity with the apostolic mission. And this is quite common, and we just saw this. This is so I did my dissertation on this. It's called appropriation and resignification, and it shouldn't surprise you. And this is very typical of the New Testament. Not that it doesn't bring forth things literally, but at times it kind of the text now is then tailor-made for the Pauline mission. Okay, then before we get into the use of Joel here in this particular text, we'll do a little bit of review here on the use of basically the Old Testament and the New, and I did some of this type of work in the volume that is published here by Brill. And in this volume I said the terms appropriation and resignification are descriptive of the process through which an antecedent text is transformed by its displacement, condensation, and recontextualization. So what this means then, the appropriation, so Paul then here, underneath his authorial hermeneutic, he is appropriating authoritative texts, and in this instance here, he's appropriating the text of Isaiah 52. So he appropriates and resignifies. So this is what he's doing over here in Romans here, in the Romans text. So Paul here would be the author. He's taking from Isaiah, and then he's appropriating from here. He's resignifying it for the needs of the sociological, theological sitz in Laban, the situation in life as Paul finds himself and the congregation, for their receptivity of the message that's coming from Isaiah. So in this process of appropriating it and applying it, the antecedent text, Isaiah here, becomes transformed by its displacement from Isaiah, its condensation, and recontextualization into the book of Romans, in this whole sociological, theological recontextualizations. So it says these methodologies assist in giving an account of the intertextual dialogue involved in a text's unrecorded hermeneutics. So what this means, the intertextual dialogue. So you have to be, the intertextual dialogue is understanding the diachronic message of Isaiah, understanding the synchronic reading that is then applied here in Romans, and then the unrecorded hermeneutics is then trying to understand how Paul then is appropriating and resignifying this text here. So you have to kind of then stand back and then give an interpretation of why has Paul, how has he gone about recontextualizing this message? Sometimes it can be literal, but a lot of times, when Paul appropriates the Old Testament, he is resignifying it, and this definitely we've already seen that Paul's resignifying the text here. Again, these methodologies assist in giving an account of the intertextual dialogue. So there's a dialogue going on in between these two texts, and how it appears in Isaiah, and then how it appears in Romans. Okay, so there's a dialogue, and so we have to discover heuristically, by discovery, how Paul is, what's his hermeneutics involved. One should not eschew the importance of diachronic textual issues. The diachronic method, so diachronic here means, what did it originally mean back in time in Isaiah 52? One should not eschew the importance of diachronic textual issues. The diachronic method pays attention to the context of an antecedent's voice. Well, what did it mean in Isaiah? Okay, while the synchronic methodological approach pays attention to the function and purpose in which the receptor text resignifies the appropriated motifs and allusions. So the synchronic methodological approach then is how is this text appropriated and resignified in Paul's sociological theological application of the text. Okay, and so this is what all these words mean. This is all this is what I did my dissertation on, and this is very important. In this manner, the diachronic text becomes fused with the synchronic text in the process of an allusion's recontextualization. This hermeneutic, in a heuristic manner, heuristic means discovery, you're discovering from heurisco, focuses on the way that each allusion is appropriated and resignified by the author for the needs of his community. In order to understand the function of canonical hermeneutics at the intersection of textual surfaces. So the intersection of textual surfaces is all occurring right here. Okay, so you have Paul's text, you have Isaiah being brought into Paul's text, and then this is the intersection of where these textual surfaces come into contact, and then this is the process of what I call appropriation and resignification. Okay, then coming in here to James Sanders, my old professor over there at Claremont. This guy was a great scholar. I really enjoyed Dr. Sanders, and he's no longer with us, but his words live on here. And I did truly learn intertextuality through James Sanders and through his methodology of comparative midrash. And what he has here, this is called the his hermeneutical triangle. And at the apex we have the authorial hermeneutic, And then at this part of the triangle, we have authoritative text and traditions that an author would draw upon. And then here is then the sociological, theological Sitzen Leben of the community to whom the author is writing. And so the author here then draws from old texts or allusions, and he draws them, and then he places them within his writing to the Sitzen Leben of the sociological, theological Sitzen Leben of the community to whom he's writing to. And then we have to then look at the determine then how the author is wanting us to understand how he drew on an ancient text for present wisdom in the present situation. And he says this: the triangle describes the way that a tradent, and we're going to say this is talking about the author, the tradent here, appropriates an authoritative tradition and resignifies its meaning in the light of the present need of the community. The top of the triangle deals with the function of the scriptural tradition. The hermeneutics of monotheism, prophetic critique, call to repentance, constituency are examples through which the methodology operates. James Sanders states that it's important to think of intra-biblical midrash as a quest, not as an interpretation or explanation. It is the mode in which a biblical author explained the world by received tradition properly brought to bear on the situation for which wisdom was sought. And so then we're then trying to understand what the authorial hermeneutic was in his use of the illusion in the present situation. Okay, and then Julia Kristeva is a huge, literary critic, and she basically did a lot of her work when she moved to France, and this is what she gleaned from Mikhail Bakhtin. With Bakhtin, moreover, these two axes, which he respectively calls dialogue and ambivalence, are not clearly distinguished. But this lack of rigor is rather a discovery that Bakhtin was the first to introduce into literary theory. Every text is constructed as a mosaic of citations. Every text is an absorption and transformation of another text. In the place of the notion of intersubjectivity, that of intertextuality situates itself, and poetic language is read at least comme double, as double. So for Kristeva, intertextuality is that when we come to read a text, her assumption is that every text is constructed as a mosaic of citations. It truly is. And every text is an absorption and a transformation of another text. And so that these texts can be read at least as double. But Kristeva is really heavy on the transformation part of intertextuality, how the text has been transformed from its displacement, from its original, textual use by a prior author, and then how it's now then made subservient to the new situation for which the new author has called upon that phrase. Okay, then coming here then to Bakhtin, this here is going to be, this guy is a master of linguistics, and I would consider him senior, and he does come from last century, and he says the following in this compilation called Readings in Russian Poetics. The speech act by its nature is social. The word is not a tangible object, but an always shifting, always changing means of social communication. It never rests with one consciousness, one voice. Its dynamism consists in movement from speaker to speaker, from one context to another, from one social community to another, from one generation to another. Through it all, the word does not forget its path of transfer and cannot completely free itself from the power of those concrete contexts into which it had entered. By no means does each member of the community apprehend the word as a neutral element of the language system, free from intentions and untenanted by the voices of its previous users. It's so classic. Instead, he receives the word from another voice, a word full of that other voice. The word enters his context from another context and is permeated with the intention of other speakers. His own intention finds the word already occupied. Thus, the orientation of the word amongst words, the various perceptions of other speech acts, and the various means of reacting to them are perhaps the most crucial problems in the sociology of language usage. Each social group in each historical period has its own individual perception of the word, its own range of verbal possibilities. By no means can the ultimate conceptual authority of the artist always be expressed in direct, unrefracted, non-conventionalized auctorial speech in every social situation. In a given social group, if a given social group has at its disposal an authoritative and durable medium of refraction, then conventionalized discourse in one or another of its varieties will hold sway. Cultured speech is speech refracted through the authoritative canonical medium. Wow, what a mouthful. And I use this in my dissertation. And so this, when he's talking about here, if a given social group has at its disposal an authoritative and durable medium of refraction, then conventionalized discourse in one or another of its varieties will hold sway. Cultured speech is speech refracted through the authoritative canonical medium. So what this is saying is that, the Bible functions in our culture, at least it did in the past, as this authoritative canonical medium. Everybody kind of quotes a little snippets of the Bible here and there and incorporates it within their speech. And so this is what Paul's doing. Intertextuality is for Paul and the apostles, the authoritative canonical medium was the Old Testament. And so then that cultured speech is speech refracted through the authoritative canonical medium. And I really like his term refracted, because as it gets, the word, as it's being appropriated and then resignified within the current context, well, then it's retaining, obviously, the previous voice. The words don't come untenanted by the previous users. Okay, the prophet's voice from the past are obviously being retained, but there is some little bit of teasing out that needs to be, that where they may alter, the phrase a little bit here and there to make it become conformed to the present situation, and so this is what Bakhtinian is talking about, and this is what he's talking about here. that this is, perhaps the most crucial problems in the sociology of language usage is this orientation of the word amongst words, the various perception of other speech acts, and the various means of reacting to them. Okay, and that so Bakhtin here is talking about how the he's talking about both the transformation and its retention, and but I think Bakhtin likes to focus on the retention part, that the voice does not come untenanted from the intentionality of previous users, and so in this aspect, it's very important that we look at Bakhtin and then we look at Kristevan, and Kristevan is really big on as we said that on the transformation part of the text, and we can see Paul doing both. He's retaining both the old and the new. And intertextuality plays an important part in how we are to go about intertextuality. So the hermeneutical triangle that I appropriated from Dr. Sanders, it starts off with the authorial hermeneutic, and then how the author then is going to then appropriate authoritative traditions of the Old Testament, this authoritative, canonical medium, all right, this durable medium of refraction that they have to, that they use to create their cultured speech, and it's refracted through the canonical status of the Old Testament itself, as we're seeing, and then how Paul then situates it here for the sociological, theological sits and Laban of the text of Romans, and we're seeing how the text is appropriated and resignified, and so we're noting things like this, and I just want you to understand the methodology and some of the these key players here of Mikhail Bakhtin, and some of the contributions that Kristevan made. Okay, so coming then here to this slide, we need to get back to our text after having reviewed the elements of intertextuality. Now let's see how this all plays out in Joel. The text, the LXX text of Joel 3:5 plays into the Pauline hermeneutics of using Isaiah 52:7 in a significant way through the pluralization of the verb euangelizomai. Note the LXX reading of Joel 3:5, and it shall be that all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, because in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be one who is delivered, just as the Lord said, even the evangelists whom the Lord has called. Its forlaga presupposes the reading of u mibasarim instead of ubisaridim. Okay, so this here, this is the way this MT text ends the Joel. It says, all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, for in Mount Zion shall be a deliverance, just as the Lord said, even amongst the survivors whom the Lord has called. So that's the MT says ubisaridim, amongst the survivors, but the Septuagint reading here, look at here, it has euangelizamenoi here, all right? Euangelizamenoi presupposes umibasarim, okay? Umibasarim right here. So I go on to state, it seems that Paul is aware of the Septuagintal altikre interpretation. because he picks up on this verb immediately as the logical shtick verb. That means the connecting link for proceeding into verses 14 and 15. Okay. Now, altikre just means do not read. So he's saying, so the altikre, Septuagintal altikre interpretation says, do not read u biseridim, but instead read u mibasarim, amongst the evangelists whom the Lord has called, not amongst the survivors whom the Lord has called. This is the altikre interpretation. And we already saw that Paul did that famously back in the previous unit that we looked at. Stuhlmacher notes that Paul substitutes the plural reading of euangeliza menoi in the LXX version of Joel 3:5 for the singular reading of euangeliza menos in his appropriation of Isaiah 52:7, the purpose of which is to widen the scope of evangelistic activity and to include a plurality of evangelistic preachers, with the quotation from Joel 3:5 in verse 13, all who call upon the name of the Lord. Paul had reminded his readers of the early Christian mission that went out from Jerusalem, in which he himself participates. Now, note how Paul conceptually inserts the Septuagint reading of Joel 3:5b into verses 14 and 15. The Joel passage speaks of Yahweh's calling or election of those who proclaim good news. Paul picks up on the Lord's calling of these evangelists for the sake of Zion's restoration as the climax of his syllogistic chain in verse 15. His purpose for the link does not concern the herald's message of Zion's beautification and salvation, but keenly makes the connection by the pluralization of evangelists and their call. Switching to the plural moves the gospel's proclamation beyond Zion to the whole world. Joel 3:5 provides the necessary linguistic catalyst for activating the switch for the universalization of the message and the apostolic mission. This syllogism in verses 14 to 15 also replaces the content of the herald's proclamation concerning Zion's glad tidings for the proclamation of the gospel. This is how Paul appropriates both Joel 3:5 and Isaiah 52:7, and then resignifies their interpretation in the development of his doctrinal message. Paul resignifies these concepts according to his well-developed theological understanding of the mission of the Gentiles and their provocation of Israel, which will lead to their eventual salvation. It's necessary to show the manner in which Paul actually strings citations together by a series of catchwords. First, analyzing verses 16 and 18, Paul begins the Stichworten by modifying the plural participle euangelids menoi, LXX of Joel 3:5b, and incorporating into the citation of Isaiah 52:7, euangelizom menon, in verse 15. Thus, Paul links the participial form of the verb euangelizomai to Isaiah 53:1 by connecting it to the noun form to euangelio in verse 16. He continues the logic of the midrashic chain of scriptures, and in so doing switches the topic from the missionaries to the message. This is an important observation. Paul explicitly shows through Isaiah 53:1 the manner in which the message is rejected by the nation. This would have undoubtedly brought to the fore of the audience's mind the servant song of Isaiah 53:1 all the way to 12. This verse establishes Israel's rejection of Jesus and his mission, but radically precipitates that the message is to believe by a foolish nation through the question, who has believed our report? So, this is where intertextuality it becomes very important and that you got to understand that Paul, and the apostles are appropriating and resignifying Scripture by making slight alterations, and this is just a typical Jewish hermeneutic of the Second Temple period, and it's it's classically seen in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in the intertestamental literature, and within the Old Testament itself. That is what my thesis was on. It all begins within the Old Testament itself. I mean, it doesn't just begin there. It's just a part of, like Bakhtinian said, it's a part of the sociology of language usage that's always been, been as long as we've been alive. Humanity has been alive. And so the Bible's no different. It participates in this. So it's just important, you guys, that we look at these texts and to note how they're to note the original context, then note how in our context how Paul appropriates the message and then it makes these slight alterations, and then you can see that it brings it into conformity with the apostolic mission. But it doesn't change it changes the meaning, but the meaning still is a valid reading. And we got to remember that Paul's not done with Zion. Remember, he may have eliminated the mountains and Zion from the voice of the midrashic, the herald, from Isaiah. But remember, the deliverer who comes out of Zion, Paul has that character coming up here in the next chapter, in verse 11. So Paul does bring this whole, his theology makes sense. He's just showing that, the Gentile mission here, and that's why Paul's making alterations. But he eventually comes around to understanding that there will be a deliverer who comes out of Zion. And we'll see that, in the next chapter. Okay, then coming then to this slide here, we will pick up here with our diagrammatical analysis. And I included therefore, and this comes from verse 14 here. And then this here, on this line, are all these other lines, how shall they call upon whom, they have not believed, and how shall believe not heard, so on and so forth here in these four rhetorical syllogistic rhetorical questions. And it comes to all here, all uk pantes, hupe kuson to euangelio, but not all have obeyed the gospel. And then he comes into a basis statement down here, gar. For Isaiah says, O Lord, who has believed our report? And so in this particular, in this unit here, he gets here, pistuo here, who has believed our report, and akoe here is the noun form of akuo for that which is heard or report. The euangelion here was just, Paul just got done quoting euangelizo in the participial form, euangelidzam, and known in the previous verse, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good things. Well, then he has brought that into conformity here with the gospel, the euangelion. And then we have here hupakuo here, and these are all, this comes from the base word akuo here, and so it's basically, it's submissive hearing, is hearing brought into submission, but not all have obeyed, and we typically translate this as obeyed. Not all have obeyed the gospel. And then he gives a scriptural basis for that. For Isaiah says, "O Lord, who has believed our report?" And this comes basically directly right out of Isaiah. Mi he'amim lishmuatenu uzeroa Adonai al mi niglata. Okay, niglata. And so this basically says, who has believed our report, and unto whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And we can see then that when Paul incorporates this, he includes the vocative, "O Lord, who has believed our report." And so he's just inserting Kyrie here, the vocative, to give a little context. Who has believed our report? And so Paul's, this is just a part of the whole appropriation, resignification, accommodation, and how the message then is to be, recontextualized. And so just remember, this is a very, very big part of doing biblical theology, exegesis, and hermeneutics. And you're going to have to give some type of study to the topic of intertextuality. So, Ross Wagner here, really great scholar here, and he definitely, he had his professor, Richard B. Hayes, and as his advisor. So this is a very capable exegete, and he says the following: despite the fact that Christ is the telos of the law, the end of the law for righteousness for all who believe, okay, 10:4, and that he is the one Lord over all, Jew and Gentile alike, who offers salvation to all who believe and call upon him. Not all, okay, upantes, have obeyed the gospel, in 10:16. So he's making this intertextual web here of pontes here in the present context, without excluding a reference to Gentile unbelief. The continued focus on Israel in Romans 10:19 suggests that in verses 16 to 18, as throughout Romans 9 to 11, Paul is primarily concerned with Israel's resistance to the gospel. Yet, just as Paul has found in Isaiah a prefiguration of his ministry of proclamation, so he discovers in Isaiah a prophecy of the rejection of the message by some. Lord, who has believed our message? Paul has not selected Isaiah 53:1 at random. A complex network of correspondences connects the wording of the citation to its context in Romans 10:18. The prophet calls out to the Lord concerning the unbelief of his hearers, who ironically ought to have been the ones calling on the name of the Lord for salvation. The lament, who has believed, echoes the promise of righteousness through Christ to all who believe, a promise announced both by Isaiah and by Paul and his associates, who preached the word of faith. But Paul finds not only that the gospel is announced beforehand in the scriptures, he also uncovers in Isaiah 52 to 53 a prophecy of his own crucial role in God's redemptive plan as one of those depicted in Isaiah 52:7, a herald sent to broadcast the good news that God reigns, that Jesus is Lord. Through his apostolic ministry, people are able to hear, believe, and call upon the Lord. Tragically, he is also the one who laments, Lord, who has believed our report. Okay, then coming then here to this very important slide here in verse 17, diagrammatically, we have ara here on stilts, and this here is another inferential conjunction similar to un, as you're obviously familiar with. So then Paul is making a conclusion from his big compound sentence between we had verses 14 to 15 here, and then he had 16, but not all have believed. And so this is all divided by all here, all uk, then we have the verb pistuo here coming in, but not all have believed. And then in verse 17, therefore faith, and then we have an ellipsis here, and we can just provide the verb est in here. Faith is from hearing, and hearing, and he just has the ellipsis again. We'll put in est in again, but so therefore faith is from hearing, and hearing is through a word of Christ. So we definitely have here these there's a lot of theology here in these prepositions. Akaes here, and dia rematos Christus. So this is loaded theologically, and scholars are going to differ, and of course I'm going to take a side here, and it all comes down here to whether this is an objective genitive or it's a genitive of source here. And I'm going with source, okay? Dia is used instrumentally. Akaes is obviously, this is source here. So, this is just, the genitive denoting source, that, faith is from hearing, okay? And then now Paul makes it more explicit, and hearing is through the agency, the instrumentality, agency of a word of Christ. And so how I'm understanding this is that, see, faith comes from hearing, but the real hearing is, what are you hearing? Whose voice are you hearing? You have to be hearing the very word of Christ that is speaking through the message, okay? And this is what we would call prevenient grace. This is how that you are, God draws those to himself. If Christ said, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. So through the preaching of the gospel, the Holy Spirit anoints the power of those words as being, coming from God himself, from Christ. It's a word of Christ. And, it's, because remember, the way the methodological, understanding of Paul is that, everything begins with God. God commissions the apostles with a message. And so they are the mibasers. They are the ones who are the evangelists. They are the ones who go out and then proclaim that message. The message isn't theirs. The message comes directly from Christ himself. Okay, so he is the the words behind the apostolic message is the very word of God himself, and he honors that, and this is how how the gospel becomes the means by which people become saved. When they hear the power of that word as being the very word of God, it breaks in. This is how we're begotten by the word of God, as James even says. Okay, he begotten us by the word of truth. This is very important, salvivically, soteriologically. And I just don't take this as, some, objective genitive that this is a word of concerning or about Christ. No, it's of course it includes that, but the hearing is through the very word of Christ himself, who's speaking his words coming out loud and clear. People don't even hear the person speaking. They hear the power of the gospel and the convicting power of the Holy Spirit. That is what brings about this hearing, and then people have to respond to that. You can reject it. Okay, we're not robots. Okay, the Calvinistic system here doesn't work, because this message here, is Paul goes on to say, did not Israel hear? Did not Israel know? Of course they heard, and of course they knew, and they rejected the message. So don't give me that garbage of some effectual call that can't be rejected. That's a bunch of garbage. We're not a bunch of determinists. And this is where I do really appreciate the present ministry of Leighton Flowers, and how he's bringing this message here of salvation, and that it's that the message comes, and people have to respond to that message. And this is how that message is inspired and comes with conviction and power to bring about salvation. But we're not robots. God gave us a choice here, whether we accept it or deny it. And just as even this text even said, anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Okay, now we come to James Dunn, and he states in his excellent commentary, "Dia rematas Christu." I'll just translate all this stuff through here, through the word of Christ. For rema, see on 10:8. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the ta rema tes pistaos ha kerusamin. That is the word of faith which we preach. In this summing up verse, Paul deliberately recalls verse 8. With perhaps the same sort of ambiguity intended in the genitive, the word of which Christ is content and author, or possibly with the same implication intended as in verse 14, Christ as the bearer of the message, see on 10:14. How shall they believe on whom they have not heard? In accordance with normal grammatical usage, the who must mean the speaker rather than the message. So Paul still has in mind the imagery of Deuteronomy 30:12-13, interpreted in verses 6-7, with Christ as the bearer of the message. The word of Christ, if weight was to be given to the point, we would have to think of Christ as the authority behind the one sent. So he's reading this as we are, that it comes through the message comes through the messenger, but it's ultimately comes from the one who commissions. So this is why he says that Christ is the content and author. That's awesome. Okay, and we also come to a very important scholar here, Stanley Porter, diarematos, he says, is instrumental. The word of Christ is the instrument, agent, or means of report. The lexem rhema refers to a statement or a word in the sense of a minimal unit of discourse. Christu, genitive of source or origin, modifying rhematos. The origin or source of the word is Christ. Some may wish to see this as an objective genitive if rhematos were to become a verb such as to say or speak. Ex akaes and dia rhematos, the contrast between the two prepositions used here in parallel structures is significant. Faith is from or out of hearing a report of good news, while hearing this report is through the word of Christ. The former signifies a figurative location, i.e. origin or source, while the latter signifies instrumentality or agency. Okay, then coming then here to C.E.B. Cranfield. Ara he pistis ex akaes he de akae dia rhematos Christu. It's not surprising. Well, therefore, faith is from hearing, and hearing through a word of Christ. It's not surprising that this verse has troubled commentators. Paul's passing over verses 15 and 16, the third condition, hearing, may be explained as probably due, on the one hand, to a desire to set directly over against the fulfillment on God's, that is Christ's part of the basic first two conditions, namely the commissioning of the messengers and Christ speaking through them. So in verse 17, Paul draws out ara, what is implied, therefore, what is implied in his quotation of Isaiah 52, applying it to the matter at hand. Faith results from hearing the message, and the hearing of the message comes about through the word of Christ, i.e., through Christ speaking the message by the mouths of his messengers. This corroborates what is said in verses 14 to 15a, but is not a mere pointless repetition, since in it hearing becomes the hinge, so that it leads naturally into verse 18. Okay, then coming then to this slide, we are now working here on verses 18 following, and this is going to be the part A of this unit here was verses 14 to 17, and then the B section is going to be from 18 to 21. But I wanted you to see how they are connected here. Allah here, and note here that this is Allah Lego, and then in 19 again Allah Lego. So these are paired here, and these two are strong adversatives to the statement that Paul just made here in verse 17. Therefore, faith is from hearing, and hearing is through a word of Christ. But so then this is going to then create a contrast of statements here between what Paul was summing up here in verse 17 and then moving forward. But I just wanted you to see here how, and then Paul uses this double negative here in both 18 and 19. So I just wanted you to see that. So this just has to be addressed. We have to look at the structure. We have to see what Paul's doing, and we'll move to the next slide. Okay, then it would be wise then here to kind of review here our structural analysis. We're here in part B here. Paul's two contrastive rhetorical questions and scriptural answers concerning hearing and knowing the gospel message, Israel's rejection and the Gentiles' acceptance, verses 18 to 21. That is how I have laid this out. And I do want to emphasize Paul's two contrastive rhetorical questions, because he begins with alla lego, but I say, and he says this at the beginning of verse 18 and again in 19. So he has, and he has two rhetorical questions. The first is in 18, second one is in 19. And they both come with their questions and answers. And it's first concerning, have they heard and have they known? And it, the double negative, the double negation is used, not the typical u may, but may u in reverse order. And following, I followed Porter on this particular, I guess, the way of explaining it, and he says the following: the combination of two negatives indicates emphatic negation. May negates the entire clause, while ook negates the verb. And so when we come to the question, Paul says, but I say, it is not that they have not heard, is it? And then we have this emphatic, conjunction, men unge, following, which is to the contrary. So of course they have heard. And he wants to contrastively state that they are guilty. They have indeed heard the message, and they have known it, because the following in verse 19, then Paul then addresses Israel specifically. And he begins again with, alla lego, and then he says, it's not that Israel has not heard, is it? And then he will move on, and you can see here that in my outline, we have Paul's first Q&A concerning the gospel's apostolic universal reach. And then you have Paul's first, adversative rhetorical question: have not all heard? And then Paul gives a midrashic scriptural answer by citing Psalm 19 to talk about the gospel's universal reach. The gospel's voice has reached the ends of the world, and the message as well. Not only just the voice or the sound of the gospel, its message has been clearly heard. And then when we move to 19, then we have Paul's second Q&A concerning Israel's knowledge and rejection of the gospel. So this is very important. Paul is, he's really laying out his case here, and you need to be able to follow it. And his second, adversative rhetorical question begins in 19. Has not Israel known? And then Paul has a two-part scriptural midrashic answer concerning Israel's knowledge of the gospel. And he first cites Moses, and then he takes up Isaiah. So he lays out Moses as the first one and he quotes obviously from the great Ha'azinu of Deuteronomy 32, and that it was Moses' song that God told him to teach them, that that the nation would know that they would fall into idolatry and turn away from God, and in the end God would save them. And so then Paul's quoting that that Israel has known this. This is a part of a famous song that the nation knew of their apostasy. And so this just here, this is this structural analysis is very important because it itemizes each thought as Paul progresses his argument here. So you should probably stop and look at this and compare and contrast notes. Okay, then we'll look here at Richard B. Hayes, very, very famous author here in terms of his contribution to the topic of intertextuality. Eclectic strategies of reading appear here and there in Paul's letters. The threshing ox text of 1 Corinthians 9, 8 to 10 is a good example, as is the citation of Psalm 19 verse 4 in Romans 10:18, where Paul transmutes the psalmist's graceful depiction of the heavens' glory into a depiction of the universal scope of Christian preaching. In cases such as these, there is no indication that Paul has wrestled seriously with the text from which the citations are drawn. He has simply appropriated their language to lend rhetorical force to his own discourse, with minimal attention to the integrity of the semiotic universe of the precursor. That means the precursor text, Psalm 19. This mode of intertextual reading is traditionally stigmatized as proof texting, but that pejorative label misconstrues the rhetorical function of such intertextual strategies in Paul. Citation of Psalm 19:4 does not prove that the Jews have had the opportunity to hear the gospel. Rather, it gives Paul a vocabulary of a second and higher power with which to assert that they have indeed heard it. Commentators sometimes fret over the apparent logical illegitimacy of such eclectic hermeneutical strategies in Paul, because as scrupulous but unimaginative readers, they ascribe to Paul's intertextual tropes a literal assertive weight that they cannot and should not bear. Very, very good words here from Hayes. So this is just basically, like I wrote, it's appropriation and resignification. Okay, then coming in here, we'll continue on here in our diagrammatical analysis here in verse 19, and so I wanted to show this here at that we're looking at these two statements of Paul should be seen as successive here, and so we looked here up here at verse 18, and so we're looking now here at verse 19 down here, but it's showing how how we are diagrammatically relating verses 18 and 19 together here. So Paul has a couple of things that couple of points here he wants to make. So now on his, he alla lego, but I say, so now we're on his, his second Q&A, and then again, Paul is going to use the me uk here. So we're going to have the double negative. And me is functioning interrogatively, so it's on stilts, and then uk here is negating egno here. It's not that Israel did not know, is it? So this is how this me uk here is going to be translated within this question. And then he to follow this up, how he answers is he says, Moses says protos. So this is the adverbial use of protos in terms of its ordinal usage. So Moses is the first that speaks, and then we're going to have Isaiah. Isaiah is then going to be the next person who speaks after Moses. But this is the only time he doesn't bring in deuteros. He only uses protos here. So it's expected to be, elliptically to be understood, to be brought in, so that when Isaiah comes up, well, then he would be the second voice. And it's always good for for the home team here to call upon Moses first with authority, drawing from the Pentateuch and then going to the prophets, and Paul does this. So Paul's batting home runs here, and he pulls out of the Ha'azinu, Deuteronomy chapter 32, the classic statement that God wanted the nation to learn in song, and that song is called the Ha'azinu here. And so Paul, had Moses. First Moses says, "I shall cause them," and I'm going to just basically read into it the Hebrew sense. I will cause you to be jealous by a no nation, and I will cause you to be provoked by a foolish nation. And so then, so this is the Paul's scriptural quotation here, and then so that the Gentiles now are being used here as a means by which to provoke the Jewish people, and that's going to play into chapter 11, and Paul will tie this all up together, that this is the method that God is going to get Israel to return, is by provoking some jealousy, and that the Jewish people, God's own people, will see that God is pouring out His Spirit and His love and His grace upon the Gentiles, while passing over them, and that's going to provoke them to jealousy, and then for them to turn. And so this is what's going on here in verse 19. Okay, then coming here, we're looking here at this portion of the Ha'azinu, taken out of Deuteronomy 32. And these are verses here 15 to 22, and we're looking down here specifically at the second distic here of verse 21 that Paul quotes. But to get to kind of the general flow of this particular unit here within the song, we'll begin here with verse 15. Vayishman Yeshurun, Vayivat, Shamanta, Avita, Kasita, Vayitosh Eloah Asahu, Vayinabel Zur Yeshuato. So this basically says, and Jeshurun was fat, and he kicked. He was fat, and he was thick, and he was obstinate, and he forsook God who made him, and he made a fool of the rock of his salvation. And then it goes on, and they caused him to be jealous by strange gods. With abominations they caused him to be vexed. They sacrificed to demons and not to God, gods that they did not know. new gods recently come up, and we'll say whom their fathers, whom their fathers did not regard. The rock who bore you, you neglected. You forgot the God who brought you forth. Yahweh saw, and he spurned, and we should say spurned them, and from the vexation, of his sons and daughters. And he said, I will cause my face to be hidden from them, and I'll see what will happen in their latter end, for they are a perverse generation, sons in whom there is no faithfulness. They made me jealous by a no God, and they vexed me with their vanities. And now this is the lex talionis, the eye for eye and tooth for tooth. And I will cause them to be jealous by a no people, and by a foolish people I will cause them to be vexed. And so this is basically, in the judgment you judge out, it'll be meted back to you. So says Jesus, and so this is basically, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth here. This is the law of lex talionis here, and so God is just dishing back to Israel what they dished out to Him, and they this is what happens when any of us or people in general when they commit apostasy, they end up getting severe judgment from God, and so this is where Paul's quoting from, and it'd be good for you to be familiarize yourself with Deuteronomy 32. It's a highly theological text that every Israelite would know and be aware of. It's very, very central theologically to the nation. Okay, then coming here then to look at this particular text diagrammatically, verses 20 and 21 here. We were looking at, first Moses says, and then remember he quoted from the Ha'azinu that God would make them jealous, provoke them to jealousy by a no people, and that and by a foolish nation he would provoke them, and now he's taking up secondly now is Isaiah. So he wanted to record the voice of Moses so that Israel's guilt would be established firstly by Moses in the Ha'azinu, and then he's going to then follow this up with the secondary voice of Isaiah, and he says now Isaiah, we should say, deuteros here secondly says, and Isaiah is bold and says, I was found by those who did not seek me, and I became manifest to those who did not ask for me. And he says to Israel, I stretched out my hands all day long to a disobedient and obstinate people. So this is he's quoting here from Isaiah here, and this is Isaiah chapter I believe it's 65 here, and this comes out of verses 1 and 2. But he's so the secondary voice to establish Israel's guilt here was what were these statements by the prophet Isaiah that rounded out the book. So this would be very, very well known, and that's why Paul draws from this text and the previous one, the Ha'azinu out of Deuteronomy 32. And still the Gentiles are here latently. They're kind of, they're hidden here, but I was found by those who did not seek me, and I became manifest to those who did not call on me. And this is being said about, Paul's applying it to the Gentiles and then to Israel. He says to Israel here, I stretched out my hands all day long to a disobedient and obstinate or gainsaying people. Classic text here. And so this plainly, clearly establishes Israel's guilt. They heard the gospel. They knew the gospel. It was prophesied to them by Moses and by, Isaiah. So they are without excuse. And this word definitely came to Israel as an authoritative word from God that they rejected, and because of their rejection, that's why they will end up in hell. Remember, we're not Calvinists here. People are responsible for heeding God's call when He calls them. When God effectually calls somebody, it's the responsibility of those people that He effectually calls by that drawing power of the Holy Spirit, that they respond. And if they don't, then it's this is just the sad thing that happens. There is good news, but if there's good news, there's also bad news. That's the flip side. There's two sides to every coin. So this is ultimately a message of hellfire. And people do need to know, if they reject the gospel, they will go to hell. This isn't, there is no universal salvation. This is eternity. This is for, this is forever. They've made their choice. They don't want to have anything to do with God. And that's, something we don't want to even have happen on our worst enemies. We want all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. Okay, so we'll round out here with Dr. Wagner. He says the following: Deuteronomy 32:21 lies embedded in the context whose principal theme is God's fidelity to Israel. The Song of Moses celebrates God's faithful character, theos pistos, a faithful God, and in whom there is no unrighteousness, Deuteronomy 32:4, and proclaims that despite Israel's infidelity, God stands firmly committed to the covenant He has made. Israel remains His people, His servants, His sons. After punishing them, He has compassion on their weary, woeful state, and rises up to defend them. So closely does God identify with His people that their enemies become His enemies. The song ends with a resounding hymn of praise to the God who avenges the blood of His sons and who will cleanse His people's land. Far beyond the catchword ethnos, the larger context of Deuteronomy 32:21 makes it a particularly fitting text to address the burning issue that consumes Paul throughout Romans 9-11, the vindication of God's faithfulness to Israel. Okay, this has been another session of Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. Please like, share, make comments, and please subscribe if you like these videos. And I enjoy doing them and putting them up, and I do look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.